How would Ukraine liberate Crimea? The Russian invasion of Ukraine by Kings in General. Let's go. If you want to go see bonus content or extended clips, go over to our Patreon. Links in the description box down below. What have you got in store for us?
When Russia annexed Crimea illegally in 2014, breaking numerous treaties signed with Ukraine and global conventions, the Kremlin was condemned and sanctioned, but this did not change the outcome. Many thought that the Russian control over Crimea was a bitter reality, which Ukraine had to accept, since the West was not going to help liberate the peninsula. At the same time, the Ukrainian army was not considered strong enough to expel the Russian army from Crimea. How the tables have turned. Ever since the start of the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the Russian army has been proving its ineptitude, while the Ukrainian army, bolstered by Western support, has liberated large swathes of its territory and is now conducting its counter-offensive. As the Ukrainian army started to turn the tide in the war, the Ukrainian political and military leadership reintroduced the liberation of Crimea as a goal they sought. Crimea.
It's something that they are after. They want Crimea back. Like
the loss
100%.
of which was considered a foregone conclusion, particularly against the background of historical and spiritual significance assigned by Putin to it, has turned into a legitimate target of Ukrainian offensive operations in a matter of months. As President Zelensky has said, everything began with Crimea and everything will end with Crimea. Welcome to our video about what a battle for Crimea may look like in this war, and how other battles for control over the peninsula have unfolded in the past 3 centuries. Nobody likes sponsors cutting into the video's flow, but a channel like ours can't survive without sponsors. At some point, we'd like to stop relying on the sponsor. The easiest and most First of all, why does Ukraine want Crimea? The easiest and most obvious answer is that Crimea is a legitimate part of Ukraine, and the fight for the restoration of the territorial integrity of this country will not be complete without liberating Crimea. This does not change regardless of what Khrushchev did 70 years ago. Ukraine is well within its rights to fight for Crimea, but other considerations are making control over the peninsula very important too. Control over Crimea is crucial for Ukraine's military and economic security. According to the retired Lieutenant Colonel of the US Army, Alexander Vindman, occupation of Crimea enables the Russian military to threaten Ukrainian positions from the south, and gives Russia's Black Sea Fleet a forward base for carrying out long-range attacks. And indeed, at the start of the war, Crimea was a staging ground for the Kremlin's offensive in South Ukraine, which resulted in the temporary occupation of Kherson and an advance in the Zaporizhia Oblast. Moreover, Crimea is currently hosting an air force base of the Russian army in Saki, along with the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the Crimean port of Sevastopol, and other components of its military infrastructure. At this point, Crimea is out of reach of HIMARS, as Ukraine has limited or no long-range precision missiles to strike Crimea, and can only target these installations via drones or saboteur groups. Still, this is insufficient to prevent Russia from using Crimea and the Black Sea as a staging ground for its airstrikes and cruise missile attacks. The Ukrainian Navy was already no match for the Russian Black Sea Fleet before the war, but the situation has only worsened due to the painful losses it suffered at the start of the war. This has allowed the Russian Navy to blockade Ukrainian ports, preventing Ukraine from exporting grain and other commodities crucial for Ukraine's survival. The grain exports have since renewed, thanks to the grain deal brokered by Turkey and the UN. But the control over the entrance of the Azov Sea in the Kerch Straits and over the Odessa Bay allows the Russian Navy to blockade Ukrainian exports. Without liberating Crimea, Ukraine will always be at risk of having its key ports blockaded, which is a massive national security threat. Ukraine is also losing industries and money due to the occupation of Crimea. Before the annexation, the Ukrainian government gave a foreign consortium the right to develop the Skifska gas field on the shore of Crimea. The realization of this project and natural gas extraction would have given Ukraine billions of dollars of gas revenue and decreased its dependence on gas imports from Russia.
That's why it's important.
But the start of the crisis in Crimea in 2014 stopped this project. Only the peninsula's liberation...
Okay, that makes more sense. Obviously, it was another adding factor. Russia definitely didn't want that income source going to their enemy and going to someone who they always believed was going to sign up with the European Union at some point. And then again, yeah, like the video just said, it means that Ukraine is also not as reliant on Russian energy.
Would enable the development of this potentially lucrative gas field for Ukraine. So Crimea is strategically important for Ukraine, but its ability to defeat Russia in the war and liberate Crimea depends on Western support. Since the start of the war, the consensus in the West has been that Crimea is off-limits for Ukraine.
Okay.
For instance, one of the high-ranking Democrats of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, noted in February that the consensus was that Ukraine is not going to militarily retake Crimea.
But they wouldn't get it in
more recent statements of Western officials
deal,
demonstrate that their sentiment has changed. For instance, the Undersecretary of State and the favorite villain of the anti-American crowd, Victoria Nuland, said that no matter what the Ukrainians decide about Crimea in terms of where they choose to fight, Ukraine is not going to be safe unless Crimea is, at a minimum, demilitarized. The Department of Defense spokesperson Sabrina Singh stated that the US would support Ukraine's efforts to liberate Crimea, and that the peninsula is a sovereign part of their country and they have every right to take that back. It looks like the United States has become less concerned with apocalyptic messages of the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, warning against any attack on Crimea. After all, Ukraine has struck the Kerch Bridge. They constantly target Russian military bases in Crimea without any extraordinary response or retaliation from Russia.
Well then. I mean, yeah, everyone's just worried about taking the next escalation, aren't they?
Crimea has peculiar geography, making it difficult to attack the peninsula and creating potential logistical problems for both defenders and attackers. Crimea has only 3 land links to the rest of Ukraine. First, the Perekop Isthmus. It is only 5 to 7 kilometers wide and has a sparse tree line. In theory, it is advantageous for the defending side, since they can erect formidable defensive lines and fortifications on the isthmus and create a killing zone for the attacking
it's just
side.
like a bottleneck.
Since the passage is so narrow, you cannot flank it, but must conduct a frontal assault. Second, the Chonha Peninsula, or Sevesh. It connects the rest of Ukraine to Crimea via the E-105 highway. It is surrounded by shallow lagoons, which can be crossed on foot in low tide, and open marshlands on all sides. Needless to say, Sevesh is not really a suitable crossing point for the attacking side either. It would be difficult for the Ukrainian army to bring its vehicles and equipment through this crossing, as the Russian army can prevent this by simply destroying the connecting highway. If Ukrainian units attempt to cross Sevesh, they may become easy targets for the Russian artillery.
Not many,
Third,
they would.
the Arabat Spit. The rest of Ukraine is connected to Crimea via the P-47 highway at this crossing.
Interesting.
The Arabat Spit is an extremely narrow strip of land, with sand roads with the Sevash Lake or the Rotten Sea on one side and the Azov Sea on the other. If the Ukrainians intend to attack Crimea through the Arabat Spit, they would have to cross the Sevash Lake, or move for roughly 120 kilometers to reach Kamyanska, a wider strip of land. The Arabat Spit has similar disadvantages for the attacking side as Sevash. You would have to move through a narrow strip of land without much vegetation, risking being targeted by the Russian artillery with nowhere to hide.
No, you would be targeted.
There is no point in discussing an amphibious assault on Crimea due to the immeasurable advantage of the Russian Navy in comparison with the Ukrainian. Ukraine will have to use one of the 3 described crossing points if it intends to advance on Crimea. Russia is already actively preparing to defend the peninsula. They are digging trenches, building fortifications, laying minefields, and anti-tank Dragon teeth in key areas like Armyansk, Chernomorska, Saki, Dzhankoy, and Kolochny, while also reportedly deploying Bastion P mobile coastal defense missile systems, Iskander-M ballistic missile systems, and S-400 air defense systems. But defending Crimea is not an easy task either. At this point, Russia can supply the peninsula through the highways coming from the key logistical hub Melitopol, and to a certain extent via the damaged Kerch Bridge. Before launching an offensive to liberate Crimea, Ukraine would have to liberate Zaporizhia Oblast, most importantly Melitopol. Retaking Melitopol would effectively mean Russia has lost its land bridge to Crimea, leaving the Kerch Bridge as the sole supply line.
And
if the Ukrainian army reached the crossing points to Crimea, the bridge would still be out of HIMARS range, but storm shadows may reach it. And instead of conducting a ground assault on Crimea, Ukraine may cut all the supply lines to the Russian army in the peninsula and siege the occupation army.
That's exactly
a ground
what I would
assault
do.
without destroying as much of the Russian fortifications, command posts, artillery, air defense systems, and other military assets as possible may be very costly for the Ukrainian army. Ukraine now has some number of Storm Shadow missiles, and has an ever-increasing drone army to engage in a campaign of systematic destruction of Russian military assets on the ground to make the presence of the Russian army in Crimea untenable. But if Russia makes a political decision to continue fighting for Crimea without ground supply...
Imagine being on that bridge and it going off. How much would you shit your pants? And if you're stuck because both sides have been like fucking destroyed and there's a hole, what you can do, you have to leave your car for sure, but you might be able to get on the other side of the road. But still, that's nuts. You'd be shitting your pants.
I see you. You haven't liked the video yet. Why not? Go on, go like it. While you're at it, you know you want to subscribe. And if you want to go to our social medias, all the links you need are in the description box down below. And you might as well head over to our Patreon as well, where you can get extra bonus content if you're enjoying this. That link's in the description box down below. But we'll get straight back into the video. Love you guys.
Supply lines. Hoping to supply its army by air and sea, Ukraine would have to conduct a ground assault into Crimea at some point. While none of the three options we listed above is advantageous for a ground assault, Sivash and Arabat Spit seem the least favourable regarding bringing heavy tanks, armoured vehicles and other supplies. The Ukrainian army would arguably have to choose the Perekop Isthmus to break into Crimea. Before that, they would have to conduct an extensive campaign of destruction of Russian fortifications, artillery and manpower in the area to make an advance through Perekop less costly.
The thing with it is you only go for Crimea once you've got the other two regions on the mainland secure. Once you have that and you're winning and you've got a stronger position, that's when you would start moving on Crimea. So you can just take your time to destroy these defences, and you blockade and siege the area as well, and just take your time.
But if the Ukrainian army actually reaches the crossing points to Crimea, destroys the Kerch Bridge, and sieges the Russian army in the peninsula for several weeks or months, assaulting the weakened Russian forces there would not be the most challenging thing that the Ukrainian army has done so far in the war. Liberating the Zaporizhia Oblast and Melitopol would arguably be more difficult. The geographic location of Crimea makes it a double-edged sword in the military sense. It is difficult to capture it due to disadvantageous crossing points, but it is also very difficult to defend due to logistical challenges. Crimea has been captured several times in the past 3 centuries, demonstrating that it is more than realistic to liberate the peninsula for Ukraine. Let's briefly examine some of the most prominent military campaigns regarding Crimea in the past 3 centuries. First, a series of battles for Crimea in the Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739. At the time, the peninsula was under the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. In May 1736, the Russian army broke through to the peninsula through Perekop, but soon they had to withdraw due to disease and supply problems. In 1737, the Russian army made another attempt to capture Crimea, this time choosing the Arabat Spit as the crossing point.
Interesting.
The Ottoman army expected another attack through Perekop, but the Russians took them by surprise by building a pontoon bridge from the Henichesk Strait to Arabat Spit. Obviously at the time, precision munition did not exist, so it was safer to advance through this narrow strip of land without worrying too much about being bombarded by artillery.
You just had the lack of food and stuff like that, so that makes a bit more sense.
The Russian army, under the command of General Peter Lacy, managed to break into Crimea, but retreated very soon due to supply problems once again. In May 1738, Lacy's army made one last attempt at Crimea in this war. This time, the Russian army crossed into the peninsula through Savash and had been successful on the battlefield, until again the supply issues caught up with them, forcing them to leave Crimea. In the 1768-74 Russo-Turkish War, Vasily Dolgorukov's army attacked the Ottoman army through Perekop. The Russian success in this war eventually enabled the Russian Empire to annex Crimea in 1783. But the Russian Empire lost Crimea briefly during the disastrous Crimean War of 1853-56. The Anglo-French coalition conducted amphibious assaults on Yevpatoria and in Kalamita Bay without much resistance from the Russians. The Allied warships were significantly more technologically advanced than the Russian fleet, which allowed the coalition forces to land in Crimea rather easily.
And then
they went on to capture Sevastopol, but could not drive out the Russian army completely from Crimea. Both sides were suffering from supply difficulties. The war ended in 1856 with the Russian defeat, but the Allies were exhausted too, not least due to the heavy battles going on in the peninsula. The peace treaty did not end the Russian control over Crimea. Crimea was also an essential theater of the Russian Civil War. In 1917, the Bolsheviks took power in Crimea, but a year later, Ukrainian and German forces under Petro Bulbachan's command stormed Crimea through Savash and took it under control. Following the German defeat in World War I, the Russian White Guard took control over Crimea, but in the spring of 1919, the Ukrainian Red Army, commanded by Pavel Debenko, entered the peninsula through the Perekop Isthmus. But only a few months later, the White Guard conducted an amphibious assault on Koktebel and Yevpatoria and took back Crimea. Finally, in 1920, the Bolshevik army, led by Frunze, captured Crimea by storming the Perekop Isthmus and moving through the Rotten Sea. Within 2 years, different sides conducted 4 successful assaults on Crimea. The next phase of the fight for Crimea took place during World War II. In September 1941, the German and Romanian forces stormed the Perekop Isthmus, occupied most of the peninsula, and started sieging Sevastopol. The siege of Sevastopol lasted for more than 8 months. In the meantime, the Soviet army conducted an amphibious assault to retake Kerch in late 1941, before being expelled in May 1942 by the Germans again. Sevastopol also finally fell to the German army in the summer of 1942. The Soviet army recaptured Crimea in 1944, storming into the peninsula through Perekop and Savash, along with conducting an amphibious assault in the Kerch Peninsula. Finally, in 2014, Russia occupied Crimea, as the Ukrainian army had been completely unprepared for the landings of Russian troops on the peninsula, who took control without firing a single shot. So it is possible to conduct successful offensive operations to capture Crimea. History shows as much. Crimea is a difficult spot to fight a defensive war due to difficulties of supply, and an offensive war for the same reason. Also due to the narrowness of the land strip which links the peninsula to the rest of Ukraine. If the Ukrainian army manages to liberate the Zaporizhia Oblast and destroy the Kerch Bridge, the Russian army will suffer from an extreme shortage of supplies. If Ukraine indeed manages to reach Crimea, they will probably siege the Russian military there before risking a costly ground assault.
That's what I was saying. I think that's the best tactic.
Big if, and the Ukrainian army would first have to defeat the Russian army in the Zaporizhia Oblast. Still, if Ukraine succeeds, we may witness a monumental collapse of the Russian army in Ukraine and a political crisis at home. More videos on Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine are on the way, so make sure to subscribe.
Well, we thoroughly enjoyed them. Make sure you're subscribed to their channel. If you haven't already, head over there. That link's in the description box down below. And of course, if you enjoyed my reaction and you want to see more, go over to our Patreon. That link's in the description box down below. And like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I will catch you in the next video.